Hello. I wanted to talk about all of the things that I've read since the beginning of the year. I usually do media wrap ups, but I haven't been watching anything really, so I wanted to talk about the books that I've been reading. Two of my goals for the new year were to pick up random books that interested me that weren't for videos or things that I had heard other people talk about necessarily, and to use my library more. So, a lot of the reads that I read in January were books that I just randomly picked up at the library, but the beginning of January, I was finishing a lot of books that I had picked up in December. So, the first thing that I read in January was Court of Shadows. I read a novel by this author in December, I believe, and I really enjoyed it. It had what I thought was going to be like a bog standard fantasy romance sort of situation, but it kind of turned out to have a little bit of fun and spice to it, so I decided to pick up this one. This is completely unmemorable, in my opinion. All I know is that all I really remember about it is that there is like fae and vampires and humans, and this is like a post-apocalyptic world. It's fine, but it really blurs together with the second book that I read that I rated that one 2 stars, and then the next one I rated 3 stars. They have very similar vibes to them, and so they kind of blur together, but the second one I would say is much better. It's A Touch of Golden Madness. This one I started and was very, very into. It's like 2 points of view. The hero and the heroine are from two separate rival families, rival royalty families, rival kingdoms, and they each have their own powers. Heroine's father is really abusive, and she manages to run away, and the hero needs her for a multitude of reasons, and so they eventually team up. And the hero has this curse thing in him that reminds me very much of Venom, which was a very fun inclusion in the beginning of the novel. And to start off, I would say the first 150 pages, this novel is so fun. Just bouncing between the 2 points of view was so tension-filled. The hero was entirely obsessed with the heroine and has been forever, and it was just a setup for a really great fantasy romance. Unfortunately, after they got together and started working together, the writing and the tone of the novel just completely changed. It just felt like it wasn't the same writing style. It felt like all of the fun character elements, all of the history, and it just all completely fell apart. And I read some reviews that said that this author was accused of using AI to write her novels, and I cannot conclusively say that. However, I will say that 150 pages into this, if you had told me the rest of the novel was written by a robot, I would have believed you, because it just completely lost all heart in it. And I read that review after I had finished it, and I was like, that makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense with what I had read, that it just completely lost all depth, and the characters just became very flat. It had all of the makings of a good novel. I am a big fan of the Venom trope. It's pretty interesting. It's obviously not a trope, it's it's a storyline, but I'm a big fan of how that sets up for a romance. It's very similar to this fantasy romance by Juliet Cross that I really loved. That one's much more funny and more urban fantasy, but he has a Venom type personality that I think is really fun. I then finished Keeping 13. I had been reading Binding 13 and Keeping 13 for a video, and I had been reading them for 2 months. It was just one of the worst reading experiences I've ever had, and it sort of made me realize that I am reading books for videos that I want to do the video more than I want to read the book, if that makes sense. And it just isn't conducive to my actual reading style, and it's just not I was just reading it because I liked the idea of giving it a shot and putting my opinion out there on this really popular YA romance, and I just detested the entire experience, and yeah, ended up finishing out the Shepherd King series. I read the second book via audiobook from my library after waiting months and months, and this was such a satisfying conclusion to this story. The first book is about Elspeth, and in this world, there's like these magical, like tarot card type things, and they all have their own abilities. And when she was young, she contracted this illness, and it allowed her to take in a creature that was attached to the nightmare card. And she joins up with the hero Raven to unite these cards because it's supposed to cure this illness that's going on in their kingdom. And obviously the continuation of that leaves off where the first one does. And I just think that this series lends itself so well to audiobook. If you're interested in it, I like the historical fiction fantasy just works so well with audiobook. The atmosphere of this is very like gloomy and dark, and you can tell by the cover, like the cover of this really embodies how the story feels. And in this second one, we got a lot of point of views of characters that I was interested in and that I wanted, and I felt like fleshed out the story in a way that the first one really didn't. That being said, the only complaint that I had about this story is that we found out a lot of information in ways that I'm not really the biggest fan of. The conclusion wasn't like the most satisfying as far as like just how everything came together. So it ended up being a 4-star, but I really like this series. I think it's really great. If you can check out the audiobook and you're interested, I would highly recommend. So then I read Homebody, which is a graphic novel memoir about this author's experience growing up trans, discovering their identity, and exploring their sexuality in childhood all the way to adulthood and what that was like for them through visual art. And I don't usually rate nonfiction, but this nonfiction has a criminally low rating on Goodreads, so I gave it 5 stars. I blew through this one. The little vignettes of the author's life were weaved together very well, and despite me not relating to the author's personal struggles with their identity and their sexuality, I related intensely with the conversations around identity, even though it wasn't like I'm not trans, and so that particular form of identity expression I can't relate to. I felt very strongly about the conversations about just they like really resonated with me and how I felt growing up with autism, and I feel like everybody should read this graphic novel, and it's just very heartwarming while dealing with some topics that I think everybody should read, and I really loved it. I would love to read more from this author. I will pick up any graphic novel they publish in the future, and I urge anybody to pick it up. It's really good. I then read The Ghost Keeper, which is another graphic novel. This one's more on the Halloween-y side. I wish that I had picked this up around like the Halloween time. I'm not usually a seasonal reader, but with graphic novels, the season just like sets the mood. But this one is about the main character who is in this ghost-ridden town, and he is a ghost therapist. He doesn't like when people call him that, but that's basically what he is. He helps ghosts like settle their unresolved feelings and move on to the other side. And he moves into this town where there are people that are like exorcising ghosts in mass, and he wants to help them before these people can do that. There's like a sweet little romance in it, and it talks a lot about grief and the afterlife and comfort and purpose. I really liked this one. Then I read, I think, one of the worst thrillers I have ever read in my entire life, and that is The Perfect Marriage. I have heard a lot about this author. I haven't actually read anything by them before, but I saw this at my library and decided to pick it up, and it was a choice. This is a thriller. It follows a woman whose husband is accused of murdering his mistress, and she has to represent him. And in the midst of like representing him, she's like finding out the truth because the police have kind of like decided that he's guilty and they're not really investigating anything else. And she teams up with a a police officer, and it's horribly done. Like, I'm convinced that this author has never talked to another human being before, has no idea how the justice system works, has no idea what lawyering even is, because this book was a fucking mess. The characters were terrible. And not even the way that, like, everybody kind of sucks and there's nobody you root for, but, like, genuinely the characters were so flat. Their decision making made no sense. You think based on their experience that they would act one way, and they always act the other way. And the twists were awful. The huge reveal at the end was such a carbon copy of other novels. This book was like trying to be 3 different books at once, and it failed in every single way. And it was just awful. I don't know how you take like a 200-page thriller and make it the most boring thing that someone has ever read, but truly, I wanted to burn the book. I wanted the book to be unpublished. That's how bad I found this, and I would not recommend it to a single person. I decided to pick up a sure thing. This is something that I saw at the library that I had never heard of before, and the cover is absolutely stunning, so I read it. I read the little blurb and decided to pick it up. This is about a trans man who has left the big city to settle in this small little town where he is selling bikes. He is a painter, but ever since he had a falling out with his old friends, he really hasn't been able to paint. And then he meets the heroine, who is in this town to hire a painter to help her with an exhibit that she is like a botanist's presentation that she's giving. She saw artwork of the heroes in an exhibit back in the city, and so she has come to this town to get his help. He recruits her to help him with this like bicycling competition, and in return he will draw for her. They don't really get off on a great foot to begin with. They have like a little meet cute accident hat situation, and she gets the idea that he's like a rake, and he like gets around and isn't very respectful and stuff, so she doesn't have the best impression of him, but they very slowly like come to admit their attraction and their pull to each other. I'm not the biggest fan of these like low conflict romances where it's just kind of sweet and meandering. That's not really my vibe. But overall, I think if you're looking for a low stakes romance, this is a good one. I read Love Redesigned. Now this is my fourth or fifth Lauren Asher, because I've read the entirety of the Dreamland Billionaires and gave them all like 3 stars, and then I tried to read the Dirty Air and couldn't even get through the first one. So I saw this at the library and thought I would give it a try, and I shocked myself by really liking this. I was very endeared by the characters and the struggles that were portrayed in the novel. So this follows a woman returning to her hometown after a really, really bad breakup with her ex-fiance. She is like a HGTV sort of person, and after the dissolution of her engagement, she loses her TV show. So she comes back to her hometown to kind of like lick her wounds, and when she's there, she runs into her childhood best friend / like rival, and she's really struggling with the grief and loss of and the trauma of like losing her relationship, and also a lot of depression. And the hero is sort of living a very solitary, lonely, empty life by his accounts. He desperately wants to start a family, but he doesn't really have any prospects. And so their families are really, really close. Their moms are best friends, so they grew up together, and they always had like this sense of competition. But their moms want them to date, want them to try to see if they can, date and see how it goes. So they ask the hero to work with the heroine to kind of like get her back into the designing thing and like get her out of her head. So they start working together and the sparks fly. This is not my favorite romantic couple. This is not my favorite couple in a romance that I have ever read. I don't know why I just like repeated myself like that, but it's not my favorite. It's definitely not like the swooniest, most like heart fluttering butterflies in the stomach, giggling, kicking my feet situation, but I intensely related to the heroine's experience. I loved how their two families showed up for them, and I liked how the hero anticipated the heroine's needs. I'm definitely interested in reading more from this series because the character and the setting are so just endearing to me and heartwarming to read, and I can see myself giving a novel like this 5 stars with maybe just like a little bit of extra work on like the romance department. I've always found her romances very lacking, and I think that's largely because I always find her characters to be very flat, and I didn't feel that here. So I feel like I'm one step away from like a 5 star Lauren Asher, you know what I mean? And like feeling what everybody else feels for this author because she's extremely popular. So I feel like I'm there. I feel like I could get there. So I'm definitely going to pick up the next one in the series. I got my 5 star romance, which love. It is Two Wrongs Make a Right. This is the first novel that I've read by this author. She's extremely popular. Really, people really like her, and so I was excited to pick this up from my library. This is about an autistic heroine and a hero with anxiety, and they get set up by their friends in kind of like a not great way that sort of pisses them off. So in revenge, they decide to fake date and then have like a really messy breakup in front of all their friends, like make their friends feel bad. But it doesn't really go that way. They end up really liking each other. They get along really well. And their relationship is just so sweet and tender and communicative. They're like the exact opposite of each other, but they work so well together. They're just two people that like can read each other. They just get each other on like the most basic level, and watching them fight their feelings for each other because they didn't like each other at first and then come to accept that this fake dating situation is not like it's not fake was just so good. I was going to rate this 4 star originally, and then Kendall decided that I actually meant 5 stars, so I kept it at a 5 star. Because the reason I was going to give it a 4 star is because the third act breakup was like actually super lame and kind of out of character. But we'll keep it a 5 star. The heroine is autistic. The representation was so good. And I love seeing autism in romances. So it's a 5 star. And I have read the second one. And the second one's also really good. So I am over the moon with Chloe Liese and very excited to read more. Add this to your list if you're autistic and you want some romances. All right, then I picked up Delilah Green Doesn't Care. I haven't read anything by this author before. I kind of just knew that this was like a sapphic romance and it was their first foray into like adult romance. This is about Delilah, who is going back to her hometown to be the photographer for her stepsister's wedding, and she kind of has plans to like sabotage the wedding, but not too much because she like really needs some money. And when she gets there, she has like a flirty moment with one of her stepsister's best friends who doesn't recognize her. And so her and her stepsister have this like bet, sort of kind of, that Delilah can't attract Claire. And so she starts flirting with her, and they have like a little romance together. At the very beginning of this, I was so freaking annoyed by Delilah, by all the characters. All the characters in the very beginning freaking sucked. Delilah was kind of the worst. Like, I get the feelings, like I get the anger and the hurt that she was harboring, but she was completely incapable of seeing other people's hurt, and she was just a frustrating character to read about. But as we got into like the more sensitive emotional side with the romance and with the characters, and we got into those like gooey feelings, it turned into something that I really ended up liking. I really loved their relationship, and there was just a lot of healing and like, I don't know, internal work in this novel that I really loved. And I love stories where we have a character that feels like they're on the outside and then they start to belong through these like little scenes of people just like showing up for each other in different ways. It just like warms my heart with those scenes. And so I was able to get over the fact that I was so intensely annoyed by her and like actually enjoyed the story. So I landed on a 4 star. And then we get to a really big disappointment for me, which is The Au Pair Affair by Tessa Bailey. Earlier in the month, I tried to read the first book in this series, Fangirl Down, and the dynamic between the two characters was so off-putting for me. She is like an intense fangirl who goes to all of his shows or all of his like golf tournaments or whatever and like wears his jersey and is like really obsessed with him. Fangirl was just too strong. You know, it was just too icky. The power dynamic is just too there. But I wanted to pick up the second one because I knew it was about a hockey player and like a nanny situation. And I find that with Tessa Bailey, if it's a more like sex heavy kind of fun book, I don't like it. But if it's really intensely emotional, like Hook, Line, and Sinker or Love Her or Lose Her, they're some of my favorite romances of all time. And so I was like, well, let's just give it a shot. And we started off so strong with this one. The hero is a hockey player. He's like in his late 30s, and he met the heroine a year ago in the first book, and he's been enamored with her ever since, completely obsessed with her. He thinks like she's the most beautiful, gorgeous, amazing thing that he's ever seen. Love that. He hires her to be his nanny, even though she's not like 100% trusting of him and his intentions and stuff. And so he kind of works to get her to trust him. And then he kind of like makes moves on her. However, this book was entirely sex. Like from the point that they started hooking up, it was all sex all the time, which was so disappointing for me because the first portion was all about like tender love and like being there for each other and like showing up and being safe and yeah, it just like supporting each other. And that completely fell apart after they started having sex, and it became all about sex, all about hooking up every time they saw each other. And there was like 2 conflicts, and the second third act conflict or whatever didn't make sense. It was stupid. I don't know. I think I'm done with Tessa Bailey because I, at this point, have more bad books with her than I do good books. And maybe I'll just wait around for like It Happened One Summer, where like that was a hit, and people that I trust in the romance community start saying good things about the novel. Then maybe I'll pick up more Tessa Bailey. But at this point, like, she's just let me down too much, and I can't trust her. So unfortunately, the hero being obsessive and possessive could not save this one. And also the dirty talk in this was a little bit like sometimes her dirty talk hits, and sometimes it's like, okay, why'd you say that? You know? And that was like one of the why did you say that situations. And then the last book that I read that I have to talk about, it is January 28th, but I don't think I'm going to finish anything by the end of the month. I could, but if I do, I'll just talk about it in my next like media wrap up or whatever. But I finished the second book in the Wilmot Sisters series, which is the Chloe Lee series, and this one's called Better Hate Than Never. This is about the heroine's sister from the first one, obviously, and she is like this globe-trotting photojournalist who has always wanted to be like on the front lines, photographing and talking about like the injustices in the world. She's like been to Antarctica and worked with penguins, like the whole 9 yards. And she returns to her hometown to help her sisters out. They're both kind of like falling apart at the end of the first one or whatever. And so she returns, but she's floundering a little bit. She had an injury that kind of put her off of work, and she realized that her work wasn't as fulfilling as it originally was, and it was kind of like destroying her mentally, and she was really burnt out. But she did feel like she could be honest with her family about that, and so she comes back and is like, oh, I'm injured, I can't like do my work or whatever, can I recover here? They let her stay. And Christopher is someone who has been really close to their family since they were children. He's 6 years older than her. They met when they were young, like their family was really close, and then his parents passed away, and they kind of like took him in as like a son or whatever. They've always had a really kind of rocky relationship because he's always been very protective of her and kind of looked at her as like the kid sister. And so he had a much closer relationship with her other sisters and not her because she was so much younger. And she becomes like a woman, and he starts noticing that, and he starts having these feelings that are really scary for him because he has a lot of like safety issues of like, if I fall for this person, or if I love this person, like what are they going to do? Are they going to die? Are they going to leave me? And she's battling with her own stuff, but this makes him feel really bad. And so he kind of starts like to make it up to her with the intention of like healing that relationship without actually getting too close. But of course, he's been in love with her forever, and so he can't really like tell her, but he can't keep away. And so they have this delightful back and forth. It's very slow burn, and I really, really, really liked it. I did settle on a 4-star for this one as well. It wasn't quite a 5-star. I do enjoy that this did not have a third act breakup, because my big gripe about the first one is like, I understand the need for third act breakups, but sometimes romances you just don't need them. Like sometimes the communication between the characters is really good, and like they can work through it, and they can have hurt feelings, but they don't need to break up and have this whole like shebang. And that's how I felt about the first one, and there was a third act breakup. This one, loved it. So good. It just wasn't like a 5-star for me. Like I did, like some of the ADHD rep hit, but in general, it just wasn't like a 5-star for me. But it was incredibly good, and I'm really excited to get to the third one in the series. So pretty excited about that. That's all the stuff that I read that I want to talk to you about. I would love to talk about what you've been reading down below. If you've read anything that I read, let's talk about it. All of my socials, aka just my Goodreads, are linked down below. Please consider subscribing if you like more book videos or vlogs. Check out my backlist. You can probably find anything that you could enjoy down there. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you guys in my next one.